Everyone in America knew her name. 50 years ago, Margaret Holloway had been untouchable. Hollywood royalty, the kind of woman whose face launched 1,000 magazine covers, whose voice made grown men weep in darkened theaters, and whose laugh had been described by one famous critic as the sound the world makes when it decides to forgive itself. She had danced at the same party as Frank Sinatra. She had been photographed by Richard Avedon. She had won 2 Golden Globe Awards and been nominated for an Oscar in 1971. She had been, for one long, brilliant decade, the most luminous woman in American cinema. But on the cold Tuesday night, when Emily Carter pushed her medication cart down the dim corridor of Sunrise Valley Nursing Home outside Cincinnati, Ohio, Margaret Holloway sat alone in room 14, feeding breadcrumbs to a pigeon through the narrow gap at the bottom of her window. And the visitor log outside her door had not been signed in 143 days. Emily was 29 years old, and she had been doing this job long enough to know that loneliness came in different shapes. There was the loneliness of Mr. Beale in room 7, who talked to photographs of his grandchildren who lived 2 states away and called twice a year. There was the loneliness of Mrs. Fontaine in room 22, who kept a music box playing the same waltz every night because the silence felt like falling. But there was something different about room 14, something that made Emily slow her cart every time she passed it. Even when she had 11 other residents waiting for their evening medications and a log to finish before 10 o'clock, Margaret Holloway, born 1942, once nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress, once described by Life magazine as the most quietly devastating screen presence of her generation. Now 82 years old, a size too small for her own clothes, with paper-thin skin across sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of deep ocean water, eyes that still held something remarkable in them, something that had not let go. She moved with the ghost of old grace. She spoke in complete sentences when half the world had stopped doing so. And she was, Emily noticed, completely, terrifyingly alone. Emily knocked gently on the open door. "Miss Holloway, I have your evening medication." The old woman did not turn from the window. "The grey one came back," she said, her voice low and measured, like she was narrating a film only she could see. "He always comes back. Nobody else does, but he does." Emily set the small paper cup and glass of water on the nightstand. She should have moved on. She had 10 more rooms and a full incident report to file about the fall Mr. Beale had taken that afternoon. But instead, she pulled the chair a little closer to the window and sat down. Just for a minute. Just to watch the pigeon with the woman who had once made the whole world stop and watch her. "Do you like birds?" Emily asked. "I like things that don't need a reason to come back," Margaret said. And then, after a pause, "That's a rarer quality than you might think." That was the night everything began. Emily Carter had grown up in a small house in Dayton, Ohio, the oldest of 3 children and the daughter of a woman who worked 2 jobs and never once complained about it. Her mother, Carol, had a laugh that filled a room and a stubbornness that had gotten all 3 of her children through things that should have broken them. Emily had studied nursing, then shifted to caregiving when the student debt made 4 more years of school impossible. She was $15.40 an hour, double shifts 4 days a week, a studio apartment with a broken radiator she kept meaning to fix, and a savings account she kept meaning to build. She was tired almost always. She ate her meals standing up most days. She had a life that existed mostly in hallways and under fluorescent lights. But she showed up every single day, and she meant it every single time she held someone's hand. In the weeks after that first encounter, Emily made a habit of stopping by room 14 at the end of her rounds. Margaret was sharp, shockingly, beautifully sharp in the way that only some people are at 82. And she had opinions about everything: the food, too soft, too colorless. The television programs, intellectually insulting. The current state of Hollywood, catastrophic, borderline criminal. The medication schedule, designed by people who had clearly never experienced a 3 a.m. that felt like drowning. She made Emily laugh in ways she hadn't in a long time. Real laughs. The kind that surprised her. But there were other things Emily noticed. Small things at first, then larger ones. The oil painting that had hung above Margaret's dresser, a small portrait of a young woman in blue, one of the few personal items in the room, was gone one morning without explanation. The carved rosewood jewelry box that had sat on the windowsill disappeared the following week. A signed photograph, Margaret laughing beside a man Emily recognized from old films, vanished from its frame. When Emily asked about each of these things, Margaret would press her lips together in a thin line and say only, "Richard came by." Richard Holloway, Margaret's nephew, the man whose name appeared on every document Emily had ever seen associated with Margaret's care. Power of attorney, financial management, next of kin contact, medical proxy. He was 44 years old, always appeared in a dark suit that cost more than Emily made in a month, always smelled faintly of expensive cologne, and always smiled in a way that showed all of his teeth and none of his eyes. Emily had met him twice. Both times he had shaken her hand with exactly the right amount of firmness and said, "We're so grateful for the wonderful care the staff provides here." He had said it exactly the way politicians say things. Warm tone, hollow center, clean exit. She had tried to push the feeling away, tried to tell herself she was projecting, reading malice into a man who might simply be distant. People were busy. Families had complicated histories. She knew better than most that the stories behind closed doors were never simple. But then Margaret stopped eating. Not all at once, gradually. A few bites left on the plate, then half a meal, then almost nothing. Emily filed a nutrition concern report. The director, Gerald Poole, told her it was normal for residents of Margaret's age. Emily flagged it again a week later. Poole reminded her that the family, meaning Richard, had been informed and had expressed no concern. "Let it go, Carter," he said, not unkindly. "You can't save everyone." Emily went back to room 14 that night and found Margaret awake at midnight, sitting in her chair by the dark window, not feeding any pigeon, not reading, not watching the television that glowed silently in the corner, just sitting. Her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged into an expression Emily had never seen on her before: resignation. "He's going to win," Margaret said without turning. "He's very patient. Patience people always win." "Who is?" Emily asked, though some part of her already knew. Margaret turned then, and her ocean water eyes settled on Emily's face with an intensity that made Emily's chest tighten. "You're a good girl," she said. "I need you to remember that I told you that. Whatever happens next, I need you to remember." Emily opened her mouth to ask what she meant, but Margaret had already turned back to the window. That night, walking to her car in the dark parking lot, Emily felt the cold settle around her in a way that had nothing to do with the November air. She drove home in silence. She made tea she didn't drink. She sat at her small kitchen table and tried to name the feeling sitting heavy in the center of her chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just worry. It was something older and more urgent than both of those. It was the feeling you get when you realize someone is asking for help in a language they've been forbidden to speak out loud. And then, on a grey Thursday morning in early November, Emily arrived for her shift and found room 14 completely empty, the bed stripped to its mattress, the nightstand bare, Margaret's chair pushed into the corner like an afterthought. The pigeon sat on the outside of the window, pecking at the glass with no one on the other side. Emily ran to the nurse's station, her heart slamming. The overnight supervisor looked up from her computer with no particular urgency. "Oh, Miss Holloway? She was transferred last night. Family request." Emily's hands went cold, because she had been in room 14 until 9 o'clock the night before, and Margaret had said nothing about any transfer. Nothing at all, except one strange thing she had whispered at the very end, pressing Emily's hand with both of hers. "If something ever happens to me, look under the floor, loose board, third from the door." Emily Carter had 24 hours of sick leave accumulated, a bad feeling she couldn't shake, and exactly zero legal authority to do anything about it. She used the sick leave anyway. It took her most of that first day to find out where Margaret Holloway had been moved. The answer, when she found it, made her go completely still at her kitchen table. Lakeview Extended Care, a state-contracted facility on the far east side of the city, a place Emily had heard about in the way you hear about things you hope never become relevant to your life. She drove there the following morning, before her shift, in the thin grey light of a Wednesday dawn. The building was large and institutional, beige brick, sliding glass doors, a parking lot with cracked lines, and it smelled when she walked through the entrance of something antiseptic and defeated, the kind of place that had given up on flowers a long time ago. Emily signed in at the front desk as a personal friend, which was only slightly untrue, and followed the aide down a corridor that felt a mile longer than it was. Room 34B was smaller than anything Margaret Holloway had lived in since her first apartment in 1961. The window faced a concrete wall. There was no chair beside the bed. The television was mounted high and angled in a way that made it hard to watch without straining your neck. Margaret was sitting up when Emily came in. She looked smaller. Not physically, but in the way people look when the space around them is too big and too impersonal, when they have been unmistakably relocated rather than moved. But when she saw Emily, something rearranged itself in her face. Something that looked for just a moment like the woman from the magazine covers. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Margaret said. "Of course I came," Emily said, and she meant it in every direction the words could travel. They sat together for nearly 2 hours, and slowly, carefully, the way you might remove glass from a wound, Margaret began to tell her the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Richard Holloway was not her nephew. He was not related to her in any way. He had been, 15 years ago, her accountant, a young man recommended by a lawyer who had since retired, quiet and competent and apparently trustworthy. He had managed her finances efficiently. He had been present during her first serious health scare, had accompanied her to appointments, had been the one to set up her residency at Sunrise Valley. Somewhere in that process, gradually, without a dramatic moment that Margaret could point to later, he had transitioned from employee to proxy to gatekeeper, and then to something else entirely. "I let it happen," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "I was frightened and I was tired and I didn't want to fight. I made the wrong choice." "What has he been taking?" Emily asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Everything," she said. "The apartment in New York, the house in Connecticut that belonged to my mother, the residuals from 3 films that still air occasionally, my jewelry, the signed letters, the archive, a great deal of money I had worked a great deal of my life to earn." She paused. "And my signature, on documents I did not fully read because I was frightened, and he was very persuasive, and because I am 82, and sometimes it is easier to believe that the person in front of you means well than to accept the alternative." Emily pressed her lips together and said nothing. What she felt was not anger, not exactly. It was something larger and more complex than anger. It was the feeling of watching something irreplaceable be treated like it was nothing at all. When she left Lakeview, she sat in her car for 10 minutes before she could drive. Then she called the Adult Protective Services hotline. She was put on hold for 22 minutes. A caseworker eventually took her report with the careful, measured tone of someone who receives many such calls and processes them in the order they arrive. He told her the typical investigation timeline was 6 to 8 weeks. Emily thanked him and sat in the parking lot for another long moment after she hung up. 6 to 8 weeks. She didn't know why, but she knew that was too long. That afternoon, she went back to Sunrise Valley for her shift. She said nothing about where she had been. She pushed her medication cart. She filed her logs. She helped Mrs. Fontaine with her music box and sat with Mr. Beale while he looked at his photographs. She did her job, and she did it well, because that was who she was, even when everything else was falling apart. At 7 o'clock, she went to room 14. It was being cleaned, turned over for a new resident. The maintenance worker was stripping the baseboards. Emily stood in the doorway and counted the floorboards from the entrance. 1, 2, 3. The third board from the door had a small, almost invisible gap along its left edge. Emily waited until the maintenance worker moved into the bathroom. Then she crossed the room, crouched down and worked her fingers into the gap. The board lifted easily, deliberately easily, she realized, as if it had been prepared, designed to be found by someone who was looking. The space beneath was shallow, but it was not empty. Inside, a small digital voice recorder, no larger than a thumb, a folded envelope sealed with wax, and a handwritten note on Sunrise Valley stationery that said, in Margaret Holloway's unmistakable cursive, "For Emily, I knew you'd come. You always do." Emily's hands were shaking as she slipped everything into her jacket pocket. She replaced the board. She walked out of the room. She kept her face perfectly, professionally calm all the way to the parking lot. She sat in her car and breathed for a long time. Then she drove home and opened the envelope. The handwritten note inside the envelope was 3 pages long. The handwriting was precise and deliberate, the kind that comes from boarding school education and hard practice. And it began, "There are things I should have told someone a long time ago. I did not, because I was afraid. I'm less afraid now than I used to be. Perhaps because I have less left to lose. But that is not quite accurate. There is one thing I have been trying to find for 60 years. One thing that still matters more than anything Richard Holloway could ever take from me. I'm going to tell you about it. But first, please listen to the recorder. Listen to all of it, because what you hear will change what you do next. And what you do next matters very much." Emily put the note down. She picked up the recorder. She pressed play. And what she heard made everything inside her go absolutely, completely still. The recorder contained 47 minutes of audio. Margaret had recorded in secret for 3 months. Each session hidden beneath the loose board, retrieved only to add more. What Emily heard was not what she had expected. It was worse. So much worse that by the time it ended, she had stopped breathing normally and was sitting rigid on her apartment floor, hands braced on her knees. The first voice was Richard's, calm, businesslike, speaking to someone called Marcus. He was arranging a competency evaluation, a legal document that would declare Margaret mentally unfit. The Connecticut property sale was already moving. The evaluation was just to make everything cleaner. He said Margaret was not going to be a problem much longer. Emily paused the recording for a full minute after that sentence. Then came Margaret's voice, quiet, precise. She described the medication change 6 months ago, a dosage alteration by a doctor she had not chosen. The confusion that followed, moving through water, the slow realization that it was not a side effect but a design. The documents she had signed during that fog. Documents that transferred property she had spent a lifetime earning. The world convinces you, slowly, that your instincts are no longer reliable, Margaret's voice said. That to object is to be difficult. And the last thing any of us want, at the end, is to be difficult. So we become compliant. And the people who want us compliant know exactly how to make us feel that way. Then the recording shifted. Softer, slower. This was not the narrator. This was the woman. In the summer of 1964, there was a fire on Coronado Street in Los Angeles. I was 22, coming home from rehearsal. A woman was screaming on the landing because her little girl was still inside. The fire department hadn't arrived. I went in. I found the child under a bed, 3 years old, coughing. I carried her out. The papers ran a photograph the next morning, and then the world moved on. But I never moved on. Because in the chaos, the smoke, the sirens, the crowd, I lost them. The mother and the child just vanished. And I have been trying to find that little girl for 60 years. She held my hand in the dark and called me the Light Lady. I never forgot her. Not once. Emily put the recorder down. Her hands had gone past shaking into something else entirely. Because her mother's name was Carol. Carol had grown up in Los Angeles. And Carol had told Emily, exactly twice in her whole life, about a fire when she was very small, and a woman who had carried her out of the smoke. She had never known the woman's name. She had always called her simply, the Light Lady. Emily put her face in her hands. She stayed that way for a long time. When she lifted her head, her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. She knew exactly what she was going to do. But the last 3 minutes of the recording changed the timeline entirely. The hearing is scheduled for Thursday, Richard's voice said. Calm, almost cheerful. Once the incompetency is on record, the remaining transfers are straightforward. The Connecticut sale closes Friday. By next week, everything will be settled. Emily checked the date stamp. The recording was from Sunday. Today was Monday. The hearing that would strip Margaret of every legal right she had left was in 3 days. 3 days. A voice recorder. A handwritten letter. And no one with any power who believed her. Emily drove to the courthouse. A clerk told her patiently what it would take to stop a competency hearing. A licensed attorney and a formal objection filed before 5 p.m. Wednesday. 41 hours. Emily walked back to her car and called every elder law attorney she could find. 14 calls. Most said no. One quoted $4,000. 2 listened carefully and then told her the same thing. Without family standing or power of attorney, she was legally invisible in this situation. She drove to Lakeview and sat with Margaret. Margaret listened to everything, then reached under her mattress and produced a letter from a New York law firm, 4 months old, intercepted by Richard before Margaret could respond. 2 attorneys had been trying to reach her for months. She had spoken to them once, briefly, before Richard arrived. Emily called the firm from the parking lot. A junior attorney named Daniel Reyes answered. He listened for 6 minutes without interrupting. Then, "Bring me that recorder tonight." She did. At 8:45 p.m., he listened to 3 minutes, called someone and said, "We're filing for an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow." Emily drove home and, for the first time in 3 days, breathed. The feeling lasted until 6 the next morning when Gerald Poole called. Measured voice, rehearsed words. A formal complaint had been filed by Richard Holloway. Unauthorized access to resident records, removal of personal property, professional boundary violations. She was suspended pending investigation. "I'm sorry, Emily, my hands are tied." She said she understood and hung up. She sat at her kitchen table and let herself feel it, all of it, for exactly 10 minutes. Then she called her mother. She told Carol everything: the recorder, the letter, the hearing, the fire on Coronado Street, the 3-year-old under the bed, the phrase, "the light lady." The silence on the line lasted so long, Emily said, "Mom, I remember the smoke," Carol said, in a voice Emily had never heard before. "I remember the smell of her hair. I called her the light lady because she seemed to glow in the dark, and I didn't have any other words for it. I never stopped wondering about her," Carol said, "for 60 years, not once." Then her phone buzzed. Daniel Reyes. The injunction had been filed, but Richard's attorney had filed a counter-motion naming Emily specifically: theft, harassment, tortious interference, a restraining order to cut her off from Margaret entirely. Emily read it twice, forwarded it to Daniel, and typed one sentence: "I'm not stopping." Then she called her mother back. "Mom, I need you to come to Cincinnati at 4:47 p.m. Wednesday, 13 minutes before the deadline." A Hamilton County judge granted the injunction. The Thursday hearing was suspended. Richard had 1 hour's notice. Emily was in a pharmacy parking lot when Daniel called. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "What happens now?" He said, "Now it gets complicated. But tonight, she's safe." The truth, once it started moving, moved fast. Within 72 hours, a journalist had the recordings. Within a week, Richard Holloway's name had become a very specific kind of famous. The kind you cannot recover from. The investigation took 3 weeks. A forensic accountant traced 9 years of transfers, the Connecticut property, $1.4 million, to a shell company. An investment account drained to zero. Signatures on documents that matched the period of heaviest medication. The authorizing physician shared office space with Richard's associate. It was, in the end, a very old story. Patient predator, patient woman, with one miscalculation. The woman had been paying attention the whole time. Richard Holloway was arrested on a Thursday, the same Thursday the hearing had been scheduled. Emily found out from a news alert while buying Margaret's preferred tea. She stood in the aisle for a full minute before she could move. Margaret came back to Sunrise Valley the following Monday. Emily was reinstated with full back pay and an apology letter she folded once and put in a drawer. She didn't need to read it. She already knew what it said. The morning Margaret returned, Emily waited outside room 14. The oil painting was back on the wall. The chair was back at the window. The room wasn't whole yet, but it was hers again. Margaret walked in with her cane and looked around the way you look at something you weren't sure you'd see again. Then she turned to Emily. "I told you you were a good girl." "You told me to remember that," Emily said. "I did." "Is she coming?" Margaret asked, very quietly. "This afternoon, she's driving in from Dayton." Margaret nodded and sat at her window. The pigeon was there, improbably, back on the sill. She watched it with something in her face that was almost peace. Carol arrived at 2:45, 62 years old, dark hair going silver, wearing a blue coat she hadn't explained to anyone. Emily waited in the hallway. She did not go in. She stood with her back against the wall and listened to the particular quiet that comes from inside a room where something long lost is being found. She opened the last page of Margaret's letter. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. "I have been carrying this for 60 years. The grief of a moment you cannot locate again, no matter how many years you spend looking. But I never stopped hoping. I want you, Emily, specifically. because I knew you would find this from the very first night you sat beside me at the window, to understand that things find their way back to each other. Not always in time, not always without cost, but they do. The pigeon comes back. The light finds a way through. Love is not lost. It is only waiting. Emily folded the letter and pressed it against her chest. Inside room 14, her mother was laughing. The real laugh. The one that filled rooms. The one Emily had grown up inside of and never fully understood until this exact moment. She was paying attention, Emily told a reporter months later, when asked what had made her keep going. After everything they took, she was still paying attention. She documented the truth even when she thought no one would ever find it. That kind of faith in a stranger. You don't walk away from that. You don't have the right to. She was working a double shift when the article ran, pushing her medication cart, stopping at each room, meaning it every single time. Emily knocked on the open door of room 14. "Good morning, Miss Holloway. I have your tea." Margaret smiled. The smile that had once stopped audiences cold and still managed to be larger in person than in any frame, and said, "Good morning, Emily. I was wondering when you'd get here." 3 months later, Margaret Holloway gave her first interview in 11 years. She spoke for 40 minutes with Sandra Okafor, who had broken the story. She spoke about the recordings, the transfers, the medication, and the long, slow process of being erased by someone you had trusted. But the last thing she said, the thing that led every subsequent article, the line that was quoted 400,000 times across social media in the following week, was about none of that. It was about a girl in a blue coat who had arrived at 2:45 on a Monday afternoon. "I spent 60 years looking for something I thought I had lost," Margaret Holloway said. "And it turned out it had been looking for me too. And there is one more thing. One thing that almost no one knows. In the aftermath of everything, the charges, the investigation, the articles, the New York law firm discovered that Margaret Holloway had made a legal document 6 months before the injunction. A document Richard had not found. A will, updated and notarized, in which she had left the remainder of her estate, whatever could be recovered, to a fund for nursing home caregivers. The fund was named in the document simply, "For the Ones Who Stay." 3 months after Richard Holloway's arrest, a letter arrived at Sunrise Valley Nursing Home addressed not to the director, not to the administrative office, but specifically to Emily Carter, care of the nursing staff. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, the kind that comes from law firms that have been in business long enough to have their own stationery. Emily opened it at the nurse's station during her break, standing up, still in her scrubs, with half a cup of cold coffee in her other hand. It was from Daniel Reyes' firm in New York. She read it once. Then she sat down. The letter explained, in the careful, precise language of people who deal in permanence, that Margaret Holloway had updated her will 7 months ago. 2 months before Emily had ever found the recorder, before any of it had begun. The document had been prepared quietly, through a separate attorney Richard had never known about, notarized and filed and waiting. In it, Margaret had established a fund. Whatever remained of her estate after the legal recovery process, the Connecticut property, the investment accounts, the residuals, everything that could be clawed back from the transfers, was to go into a charitable trust. The trust had one purpose: grants for nursing home caregivers, continuing education, mental health support, emergency financial assistance, people who did the work that no one saw and no one adequately paid for and no one, in the long run, properly thanked. The fund had a name. Margaret had chosen it herself, handwritten in the margin of the original document in her precise cursive, and the attorneys had included it exactly as written. For the ones who stay. Emily put the letter down on the counter. She looked at the corridor in front of her. The long, fluorescent-lit hallway she had walked thousands of times. The medication cart waiting at the far end. The faint sound of a television from room 9. The smell of institutional cleaning solution and something underneath it. Something human and irreducible that she had never been able to name, but had always recognized. She thought about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs and never complained. She thought about every caregiver she had ever worked beside. The ones who stayed late without pay. The ones who held hands through the night. The ones who learned which resident liked their blinds half open and which one needed the television on low to sleep. The ones whose names appeared in no headlines. The ones who showed up anyway. She picked the letter back up and read it again. At the bottom, beneath the firm's signature block, there was a handwritten postscript. Not from the attorneys, from Margaret. Emily, I wrote this before I knew who you were. Before I knew about Carol or the fire or any of it. I wrote it because I had been watching the staff here for 2 years, and I had seen something I wanted to honor. I had seen people do difficult, invisible work with extraordinary care, and I had enough money left, barely after everything, to say something about it that would last. I want you to know that you did not earn this by finding the recorder or stopping Richard or any of what came after. You earned it the first night you sat down beside an old woman at a window and watched a pigeon, with her for no reason except that it seemed like the right thing to do. That is the whole of it. That is everything. Emily folded the letter. She stood in the corridor for a long moment, very still, the way you stand when something has just rearranged the furniture inside you, and you need a moment before you can move through the room again. Then she picked up her medication cart. She checked her log. She started at room 1 and worked her way down the way she always did, stopping at each door, calling each name, meaning it every single time. Outside room 14, she paused. Margaret was inside. She could hear the low murmur of the television, the particular silence beneath it that meant Margaret was reading rather than watching. The pigeon was on the sill, because the pigeon was always on the sill now, as if it had decided this was simply where it lived. Emily knocked. "Come in." She pushed the door open. Margaret was in her chair with a book, her silver hair caught in the afternoon light, her ocean water eyes lifting from the page with the unhurried attention of someone who has decided that everything deserves to be looked at properly. "Your evening medication, Miss Holloway." "Thank you, Emily." Margaret took the small paper cup. She looked at Emily's face for a moment with the particular directness she had always had, the thing that had once made critics write entire paragraphs, trying to describe what it felt like to be looked at by her. "You got the letter?" "I got the letter." Margaret nodded once, satisfied, and returned to her book. "Good," she said simply. "Then everything is in order."